I don't know if this is the right place to post this. To be honest, I just need a record of it somewhere that isn't locked in a police file or buried in my therapist's notes. I've been listening to a lot of true crime and survival stories lately, trying to find someone who has gone through something similar. I haven't found anyone. If you're reading this aloud or listening to it, I want you to understand something right up front. There are no Wendigos in this story. There are no skinwalkers, no ancient curses, no ghosts in the trees. I used to be terrified of the paranormal. Now I know the absolute worst thing you can find in the deep woods is another human being. This happened 2 years ago. I'm changing a few names and locations because it is still technically an open investigation, though the cops have long since stopped actively looking. At the time, my girlfriend Sarah and I had been dating for about 3 years. We were in a rut. You know that phase of a relationship where the silence in the car goes from comfortable to suffocating? That was us. We were both working heavy corporate jobs, stressed out and drifting apart. Sarah was the outdoorsy one. She grew up in the Pacific Northwest, practically raised in hiking boots. I liked camping, but my idea of roughing it was a state park with a shower block half a mile away. So when she suggested a week-long off-grid backpacking trip deep in a remote section of Crown Land up north, I hesitated. But she pitched it as a way to unplug, reset, and save our relationship. She said we needed to get away from screens, from people, from everything, just to remember who we were to each other. I agreed. I loved her and I wanted to fix things. We spent weeks prepping. Well, she prepped. Sarah bought the topographical maps, planned the route, and dehydrated the meals. She was meticulous. That detail haunts me now. The drive up took 9 hours. The last 2 hours were entirely off pavement, taking my SUV down increasingly narrow logging roads that eventually just dissolved into a wall of dense, towering evergreens. The trailhead wasn't even an official park entrance. It was just a widening in the gravel where a rusted-out gate blocked an old access road. When I killed the engine, the silence actually made my ears ring. There was no wind, no birdsong, just the heavy, oppressive quiet of millions of trees suffocating the landscape. We strapped on our packs, mine was pushing 50 pounds, and set off. The first day was brutal but beautiful. The forest was ancient. Giant Douglas firs and cedars that blotted out the sun, leaving the forest floor covered in a thick, spongy carpet of moss and decaying needles. We hiked about 8 miles in. Sarah was leading, checking her compass and a heavily annotated paper map. I remember feeling a creeping sense of isolation. Every time I looked back, the trail we had just walked seemed to vanish into the shadows. But Sarah was unusually upbeat. For the first time in months, she was smiling, pointing out strange fungi and animal tracks. I thought the trip was working. We made camp by a small, stagnant creek. We ate in silence, watching the tiny backpacking stove blue flame. "How far out do you think the nearest person is?" she asked me suddenly, staring into the dark. "I don't know," I said. 10 miles? 20? "We're completely on our own out here," she murmured. If something happened to me, how long do you think it would take for you to find help? I laughed it off, thinking she was just trying to spook me. I'd just follow the trail back, babe. We'd be fine. She didn't laugh. She just stared at the tree line and whispered, "Right." Day 2 is when things started to feel wrong. We broke camp early. Sarah insisted we go entirely off trail. She said she knew of a pristine, hidden alpine lake from a forum she frequented. I argued against it. My navigation skills were non-existent, and the woods out here all looked exactly the same. But she was adamant. We spent 6 hours bushwhacking. The terrain was awful. Deadfalls that required us to climb over massive, rotting trunks, thorny underbrush that tore out our pants, and uneven ground that threatened to roll an ankle with every step. By late afternoon, I was exhausted, sweaty, and annoyed. The canopy was so thick it felt like twilight at 3 p.m. Then, I noticed the markers. They weren't official trailblazes. They were small, subtle things. 3 rocks stacked on a stump, a branch bent and tied with a microscopic piece of faded green paracord. Sarah would glance at them and slightly adjust our heading. "Are we following a trail?" I asked, panting as I caught up to her. "Just an old trapper's route," she said without looking back. "We're almost there." We weren't almost there. We didn't reach a lake. Instead, as the sun began to truly set, we entered a depression in the woods. A kind of bowl surrounded by steep, rocky ridges. The air down there was 10 degrees colder and smelled sharply of ozone and rotting wood. "We need to set up camp," I told her, dropping my pack. "It's getting too dark." She agreed without a fight, which surprised me. She seemed jittery. Her eyes kept darting up to the ridge. We pitched the tent and ate a cold dinner because neither of us had the energy to collect firewood. The exhaustion was deep in my bones. I crawled into my sleeping bag at 8 p.m. and fell into a dead, heavy sleep. I woke up at exactly 3:14 a.m. I know the time because I immediately checked my watch. The air inside the tent was freezing. The moisture from our breath had condensed and frozen on the nylon walls. I was shivering, and the reason I was shivering was that the tent door was completely unzipped. The flap was tied back. "Sarah?" I croaked, my throat dry. I reached over to her sleeping bag. It was empty. It was cold to the touch. I sat up, the grogginess instantly evaporating into a sharp, icy spike of adrenaline. "Sarah?" I called out louder. Silence. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, grabbed my headlamp, and stepped out of the tent in just my thermals and boots. The darkness outside was absolute. It felt like standing at the bottom of the ocean. My headlamp beam cut through the freezing fog, illuminating the trunks of the pines like prison bars. "Sarah, this isn't funny," I yelled. My voice didn't echo. The woods just swallowed it. I walked a quick circle around the campsite. Her pack was still inside the tent. Her boots... Wait, I shone the light down. Her hiking boots were gone. Panic started to set in. Was she sleepwalking? Did she go to use the bathroom and get turned around in the dark? People die out here just walking 50 feet from their tent and losing their bearings. I spent the next 3 hours pacing near the tent, yelling her name until my voice was hoarse. I blew the emergency whistle on my pack over and over. The shrill sound hurt my ears, but nothing answered back, not even an owl. When the sun finally began to rise, turning the sky a pale, bruised gray, the real horror of the situation hit me. I was deep in the back country, completely lost, and my girlfriend was gone. I knew I had to make a decision: pack up and try to find my way back to the car to get search and rescue, or look for her. The thought of leaving Sarah out there alone in the freezing temperatures was unbearable. I decided to give myself 2 hours to find a trail. If I couldn't, I would hike out. I packed a small day bag: water, first aid kit, a knife, and some protein bars. I left the brightly colored tent up as a marker. I started sweeping the perimeter in expanding circles. The ground was hard, but in the softer mud near a dried up creek bed, I found it. A distinct boot print. The tread matched Sarah's obnoxiously expensive Italian hiking boots. It was pointed away from camp, heading up the steep, rocky ridge we had camped beneath. I followed. The climb was brutal, but I found another print. Then, half a mile later, I found a piece of torn fabric caught on a briar patch. It was a tiny shred of bright orange Gore-Tex, Sarah's jacket. My heart leapt. She had gone this way. I picked up the pace, my fear morphing into a frantic kind of hope. I pushed over the crest of the ridge and looked down into the next valley. The forest here was different. The trees were thinner and sicklier, and I could smell something faint on the wind. Wood smoke. Somebody had a fire. Relief washed over me so powerfully my knees nearly buckled. She must have gotten lost, wandered over the ridge, and found another camper or a hunter's cabin. She was probably sitting by a fire right now, drinking coffee and waiting for the sun to come up properly. I scrambled down the far side of the ridge, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. The smell of smoke grew stronger. About 20 minutes later, I saw the structure. It wasn't a campsite. It was an old, dilapidated logging shack nestled against a rock wall, half swallowed by the forest. Tarps were strung up between the trees to create a covered outdoor area. There was a rusted out ATV parked under one of the tarps, covered in pine needles. It looked like it had been there for years, but the fire burning in the stone pit outside the cabin was fresh. I slowed down. My instincts, honed by years of consuming true crime, suddenly kicked in. This didn't look like a friendly hiker's camp. It looked like a squatter's compound. It looked like a place where people go to not be found. I crept closer, staying behind the thick trunks of the cedars. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my teeth. There were voices coming from inside the cabin. I moved to the side of the structure, stepping carefully over dead leaves until I was pressed against the rotting wood siding, right next to a grime-caked window. I held my breath and listened. There were two people, a man and a woman. "You sure he was asleep?" the man asked. His voice was gravelly, relaxed. "He was dead to the world," a woman replied. My blood ran completely cold. It was Sarah, but she didn't sound scared. She didn't sound like a victim. She sounded calm, bored almost. "I slipped the crushed Benadryl into his water bottle right after we set up the tent," she continued. "He complained about the taste, but he drank the whole thing. He's probably still snoring." I stood there paralyzed. My brain refused to process the words. Benadryl. "Good," the man said. I heard the clinking of metal. Maybe a rifle bolt being racked or tools being shifted. "You left the breadcrumbs?" "The boot prints and the torn fabric, yeah. He'll find them. He thinks he's a detective." She laughed. A genuine bright laugh that I had heard 1,000 times in our apartment. It sounded monstrous here. "He'll follow the trail up the ridge. If he doesn't, we can just go back to the camp and finish it there. But it's better if he has an accident on the rocks. Much cleaner for the insurance payout. Life insurance? The man asked. $500,000 plus the house. I get it all if he slips and falls in the back country. We play the grieving widow routine for 6 months and then I move out here with you. I felt the world tilt. Everything. The sudden interest in this specific trip. Her insistence on going off trail. The shortcut that took us nowhere. Her morbid questions by the fire. It wasn't a vacation to save our relationship. I was being walked to my own execution. She had lured me deep into the wilderness to be murdered by whoever this guy was. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to put my hand against the cabin wall to steady myself. That was a mistake. The wood under my palm was rotted. As I leaned my weight on it, the board gave way with a loud, violent crack. The voices inside stopped instantly. Dead silence. "Did you hear that?" the man whispered. "Get the gun," Sarah said. The boredom in her voice was gone. It was replaced by a cold, surgical sharpness. Adrenaline, pure, unadulterated survival instinct, flooded my system. I didn't think. I just turned and ran. I sprinted back toward the ridge, not caring about the noise. Behind me, I heard the cabin door kick open. "Hey!" a deep voice roared. I scrambled up the steep incline, my boots slipping on the loose shale and wet leaves. I dug my hands into the dirt, grabbing roots and pulling myself up like an animal. Bang! The gunshot echoed through the valley like a thunderclap. The bark of a tree 2 feet to my left exploded, showering my face with splinters. I screamed, a pathetic, terrified sound, and pushed harder. I crested the ridge and threw myself over the top, tumbling down the other side just as the second shot rang out. I hit the bottom of the slope hard, tearing my pants and shredding my forearms on the rocks, but I didn't stop. I forced myself up and began to run wildly through the dense brush. I had no compass, my phone was back at the tent, and I had no idea which way the car was. I just knew I had to put distance between myself and them. The forest was a nightmare obstacle course. Branches whipped my face, drawing blood. I tripped over roots, fell into unseen holes, and pushed through thorny thickets that tore up my clothes and skin. Behind me, I could hear the crashing of a heavy body moving through the brush. The man was pursuing me. I ran until my lungs felt like they were bleeding. I ran until my legs were numb blocks of lead. Hours must have passed. The light began to shift as the afternoon wore on. I was severely dehydrated, exhausted, and hopelessly lost. I found a hollow beneath the massive, upturned root system of a fallen cedar tree and crawled inside, curling into a tight ball against the damp earth. I lay there, shaking violently, trying to muffle the sound of my own ragged breathing. As dusk fell, the temperature plummeted. The woods grew silent again. Then I heard it. Crunch, crunch. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. They were maybe 50 yards away. Through the tangle of roots, I saw the sweeping beam of a heavy-duty flashlight cutting through the darkening woods. "Babe?" It was Sarah's voice. It echoed through the trees, laced with panic and tears. "Babe, please, where are you? Help me." I covered my mouth with both hands to stop myself from making a sound. The psychological torture of hearing the woman I loved begging for her life, knowing it was a trap, was worse than the gunshots. "He's got a gun. Please, I'm hurt. My leg is broken. Please, help me." She sobbed. It sounded so incredibly real. If I hadn't stood outside that window, I would have thrown away my life running out to save her. The flashlight beam swept over the fallen tree I was hiding under. The light pierced the gaps in the roots, blinding me for a fraction of a second. I squeezed my eyes shut and held my breath until my vision went spotty. "Stop yelling," the man's voice muttered, much closer now. "If he's out of here, he's frozen by now. Let's head back to his camp and wait. He'll have to go back for his gear." "I want him found, Mark," Sarah hissed, dropping the crying act instantly. Her voice was ice. "I'm not spending another night out here if he's alive." "We'll find him, or the cold will. Let's go." The flashlight beam slowly drifted away. The footsteps receded into the dark. I didn't move. I stayed in that hole beneath the roots for 10 hours. That night was the longest of my life. The temperature dropped below freezing. I had no jacket, just my thermal shirt. I developed mild hypothermia. I shook so hard I bruised my own ribs. Every snapping twig, every rustling leaf, sounded like them returning to finish the job. I hallucinated Sarah's face in the dark, smiling at me. I imagined the barrel of a rifle pressing against my forehead. When the sun finally began to rise, turning the woods a dim, hazy blue, I forced myself to crawl out of the hole. My joints were so stiff I could barely stand. I knew I couldn't go back to the camp. They were waiting there. I had to find a way to the logging road entirely on my own, relying on nothing but the position of the sun. I knew we had driven roughly north to get to the trailhead, and we had hiked generally east. I needed to go west. I walked for 14 hours. I didn't stop to rest. I drank water from muddy puddles, not caring about parasites. My boots were soaked, my feet covered in ruptured blisters. I looked over my shoulder every 10 seconds, gripped by a paranoia so deep it felt like madness. Every shadow looked like a man with a rifle. Sometime in the late afternoon, I smelled something that wasn't pine or dirt. It was diesel exhaust. I pushed through a final thicket of briars and stumbled, quite literally, onto the gravel logging road. I dropped to my knees and cried. I was about 3 miles south of the trailhead where we had parked. I began the agonizing walk up the road, staying close to the tree line just in case. When I finally saw my SUV in the distance, my heart soared. But as I got closer, the dread returned. The car was sitting on its rims. All 4 tires had been slashed. They had beaten me back to the car. They wanted to make sure I couldn't leave. I immediately ducked back into the woods, terrified they were waiting in the trees nearby. I hid in a drainage ditch by the side of the road for another 3 hours until I heard the heavy, mechanical roar of an engine. A commercial logging truck was coming down the road, heading back toward the highway. I scrambled out of the ditch and ran into the middle of the gravel road, waving my arms like a lunatic. The truck laid on its horn, the massive tires locking up and skidding on the gravel, stopping just 20 feet in front of me. The driver, a burly guy in his 50s, swung the door open looking furious, but when he saw me, covered in mud, blood, and ripped clothes looking like a feral animal, his expression changed. "Get in," he yelled. I climbed into the cab, locked the door, and collapsed. By the time I got to a police station in the nearest town, it was pitch black again. I sat in a brightly lit interrogation room, wrapped in an emergency blanket, and told the detectives everything. The hike, the markers, the cabin, the conversation, the gunshots. They sent a tactical unit up the logging road at dawn. 2 days later, The lead detective sat me down. His face was unreadable. They found my car and they hiked the trail to our campsite. The tent was gone. My backpack, her backpack, the sleeping bags, everything was gone. The campsite had been meticulously swept clean. Using my directions, they found the hollow in the ridge. They found the old logging shack, but it was abandoned. There was no ATV, no tarps. The fire pit was cold. They dug out a single bullet from a tree near the ridge, but it was heavily deformed. And they found no sign of Sarah or the man named Mark. Because I was the last person seen with her, and because of the life insurance policy I didn't even know she had finalized the week before, I was the prime suspect. I spent a year fighting off the suspicion of murder. The only thing that saved me from prison was my lack of a criminal record, the gunshot residue test coming back negative, the slashed tires on my own car, and the fact that they never found a body. Officially, Sarah is listed as a missing person, lost in the woods, a tragic backpacking accident. Her family hates me. The internet sleuths who found the local news articles think I'm a mastermind who hid his girlfriend's body in the deep woods and made up a crazy story about a backwoods hitman to cover my tracks. But I know the truth. I know she's out there. I know she's alive. Sometimes, when I'm lying in my bed in my new apartment, in a city surrounded by millions of people, I hear the floorboards creak, and for a split second, I'm back in the woods. I'm back under that tree, freezing to death, listening to the woman I loved practice the fake tears she would use to lure me into the sights of a rifle. If you ever go out into the deep woods, and you find a trail marker that isn't on the map, don't follow it. Just turn around. You have no idea who is waiting at the end of the line. This goes back to June 2019. We had just graduated high school. There were 4 of us, a tight-knit group of guys who had been best friends since middle school, mostly because we all lived on the same suburban cul-de-sac. There was me, Dave, Sam, and Chris. Chris was the center of our universe, whether we liked it or not. He was the star quarterback, the guy with the rich parents, the one who always had the keys to a car and money for a beer. But Chris also had a vicious, cruel streak. He was the kind of guy who would publicly humiliate you just to get a laugh and then buy you a pizza afterwards so you couldn't stay mad. Dave and I mostly managed to fly under Chris's radar by just going along with whatever he wanted. But Sam caught the worst of it. Sam was quiet, a bit smaller than the rest of us, and desperately wanted to fit in. Chris treated him like a personal punching bag. He'd flirt with the girls Sam liked. He'd accidentally spilled drinks on Sam's laptop. He'd make brutal jokes about Sam's mom who struggled with addiction. We all saw it, but none of us stopped it. We were cowards. We just wanted to be part of the cool crowd, and Chris was our ticket. Sam just took it, always laughing along, always being the loyal sidekick. To celebrate graduation, Chris decided we were going to a deep woods camping trip. Not a state park with paved trails and public bathrooms. Chris wanted to go completely off-grid into the dense timber of the Appalachian Mountains. He found this old logging map online and pointed to a ridge miles away from any cell tower or ranger station. The plan was to hike in, set up camp for 4 days, drink our weight in cheap beer, and shoot off some illegal fireworks. We packed Dave's rusted-out Jeep with tents, sleeping bags, and an irresponsible amount of alcohol, and drove 6 hours north into the mountains. I'll never forget the feeling of leaving civilization behind. As we drove higher into the elevation, the radio turned to static, and the little bars on my phone screen vanished one by one. The trees closed in around the narrow dirt road, towering pines and thick oaks that blocked out the sun. By the time Dave parked the Jeep at the end of a forgotten, overgrown logging trail, the air felt different. It was heavier, cooler, and smelled like damp earth and rotting wood. We strapped on our heavy packs and hiked for another 3 hours, pushing through the thick brush and climbing steep, unmarked terrain until we reached a flat clearing near a small creek. We were miles from anyone. If you screamed out there, the trees would just swallow the sound. The first night was exactly what we expected. We built a massive fire, drank too much, and talked about college and our plans for the future. Chris was in peak form, holding court, roasting Sam mercilessly about a girl who had rejected him at prom. Sam just sat by the fire, nursing his beer, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I remember looking at Sam and feeling a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. I wondered why he even hung out with us. But the alcohol quickly washed that thought away. When we finally crawled into our tents, Chris and Dave in one and me and Sam in another, I fell asleep instantly, lulled by the rushing sound of the creek. The weirdness started on the second day. We woke up hungover and groggy. Chris wanted to go explore the ridge, so we spent the afternoon hiking around the dense timber. That's when we found the first strange thing. About a mile from our camp, deep in a thicket of briars, we stumbled across a campsite. But it wasn't a normal campsite. It was a single, filthy sleeping bag resting on a tarp. Hung from the branches above it were dozens of little charms made of twine, animal bones, and rusty nails. The smell of the place was awful, like spoiled meat. There was no fire ring, no trash, just that sleeping bag and those weird Blair Witch-style ornaments clacking together in the wind. Chris, of course, thought it was hilarious. He started mocking it, picking at the sleeping bag. Dave and I were deeply unsettled, and Sam looked physically sick. We convinced Chris to leave, but the atmosphere of the trip had shifted. The woods didn't feel empty anymore. They felt occupied. The walk back to our camp was dead silent. We didn't see any wildlife. No deer, no squirrels, not even the chirping of birds. Just the oppressive, heavy silence of the deep timber and the constant feeling that eyes were tracking us from the shadows of the tree line. That night, the temperature plummeted. We huddled around the fire, jumping at every snapped twig in the dark. Chris was trying to act tough, telling ghost stories and laughing too loud, but even he seemed tense. Around midnight, Dave went to his tent to get another layer of clothing. I heard him unzip his bag, and then I heard him gasp. He backed out of the tent, holding something in his shaking hand. He brought it over to the firelight. It was a Polaroid photograph. The colors were faded and washed out, but the image was clear. It was a picture of Dave and Chris, fast asleep in their sleeping bags. The blood drained from my face. I couldn't breathe. The photo had been taken from inside their tent, looking down at them. Someone had unzipped their tent while they slept the night before, leaned inside, and taken a flash photograph with a Polaroid camera, and neither of them had woken up. And then, whoever it was had slipped the photo into Dave's bag for him to find. Panic exploded. We were completely defenseless, miles from the car, in the pitch black, being hunted by someone who was clearly unhinged. Chris was screaming, grabbing a heavy Maglite flashlight and swinging it around into the darkness, challenging whoever was out there to show themselves. Sam was hyperventilating, begging us to pack up and run. I had to physically grab Sam by the shoulders and shake him, telling him that running blindly through the deep woods in the dark was a death sentence. We'd break our ankles or get hopelessly lost. We had to wait for dawn. We dragged both tents together and sat back to back in a tight circle around the roaring fire, clutching pocket knives and heavy sticks. Nobody slept. We just sat there listening to the woods. The silence had been replaced by deliberate mocking sounds. Every 20 minutes or so, we would hear heavy footsteps crunching just beyond the reach of the firelight, pacing, circling us. Occasionally, a rock would hit the dirt near our feet, tossed from the absolute blackness of the trees. We were being toyed with. It was psychological torture. It felt like true crime happening in real time, and we were the victims. By 3 a.m., the fire was burning low. We were running out of dead wood, and nobody dared to step into the dark to gather more. The pacing footsteps had stopped for about an hour. Exhaustion was fighting a war with adrenaline, and despite the terror, my eyes kept drifting shut. Dave was quietly crying. Sam was staring blankly into the dying embers. Chris was gripping his flashlight so hard his knuckles were white. Then nature called. Chris muttered that he couldn't hold it anymore. He stood up, flashlight in hand, and walked about 15 feet to the edge of the tree line to pee. He didn't want to go further, and we didn't want him to either. We watched his flashlight beam hit a thick oak tree. Then, the beam dropped. It hit the dirt, rolling wildly. A split second later, Chris screamed. It wasn't a yell of surprise, it was a wet, ragged, agonizing shriek that tore through the night. I heard a massive rustling of bushes, the sound of tearing fabric, and a heavy, wet thud. "Help!" Chris gurgled, his voice suddenly sounding distant, like he was being dragged backwards at an impossible speed. "Oh God, help me!" Sam leaped to his feet, screaming at the top of his lungs. "He's got a knife! There's a guy with a knife!" Sam pointed into the dark where Chris had vanished. Dave completely snapped. He didn't even look. Dave just turned and sprinted blindly into the pitch-black woods in the opposite direction. I froze, paralyzed by a fear so intense I actually lost control of my bladder. I stared into the dark where Chris had been standing. The flashlight was rolling on the ground, casting wild, spinning shadows. For a fraction of a second, in the spinning beam of light, I saw the bushes part. I didn't see a face, I just saw a massive, filthy pair of work boots dragging Chris's thrashing legs into the deep brush. Sam grabbed my jacket and yanked me so hard I fell backward. "Run!" he shrieked. The spell broke. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I ran with a desperation I didn't even know the human body was capable of. Sam and I crashed through the woods. Branches tearing at our faces, thorns ripping our clothes. We ran completely blind, tripping over roots, falling down ravines, scraping our hands and knees on rocks, but we never stopped moving. Behind us, swallowed by the distance and the trees, Chris's screams eventually stopped. The silence that followed was worse. We ran until the sky started to turn gray, eventually collapsing by a muddy riverbank. We were covered in blood and dirt, shivering uncontrollably. By pure luck, we followed the river and eventually hit a logging road, which led us to a highway. A passing trucker picked us up and called the state police. The next 48 hours were a blur of interrogations, rescue dogs, and sirens. They found Dave first. He had climbed a tree and tied himself to a branch with his belt so he wouldn't fall out. He was completely catatonic. It took them 4 days to find Chris. The search and rescue team found him buried under a pile of rocks and leaves about 2 miles from our campsite. I'll spare you the graphic details the police later shared with us, but the official report stated he was the victim of a brutal, frenzied knife attack. The authorities concluded we had been stalked by a transient living in the woods, someone violently territorial and completely off-grid. They searched the area for weeks, found the creepy campsite, but they never found the man. The case went cold. The trauma ruined us. Dave moved across the country and refuses to speak to any of us. I spent years in intense therapy, dealing with the survivor's guilt and the nightmares of that spinning flashlight beam. The only person who stayed in my life was Sam. We bonded over the shared trauma. He was the only one who understood what it was like to survive that night. Over the last 7 years, Sam and I became like brothers. He got a good job in IT, bought a nice little house in the suburbs, and always made sure to check in on me when June rolled around. That brings me to tonight. My apartment flooded yesterday because of a burst pipe, so Sam offered to let me crash in his guest room for the weekend. We had a few beers, watched a movie, and he went to bed early. I was sitting in the guest room trying to sleep, but I was restless. I realized I had left my phone charger in my car, but it was pouring rain outside. I figured Sam wouldn't mind if I poked around his home office to see if he had a spare USB cord in his desk drawers. I went into his dark office, turned on the small desk lamp, and opened the bottom drawer. It was mostly old tax documents and cables. I dug around toward the back, and my fingers brushed against a heavy, locked metal lockbox. It wasn't hidden very well, just tucked behind some folders. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was just morbid curiosity. Or maybe it was the fact that the little key was taped right to the bottom of the box. Without really thinking, I peeled the tape off and stuck the key in the lock and turned it. The box clicked open. Inside, resting on a bed of old receipts, was a heavy silver high school class ring. The gem was a ruby red. Carved into the side was the year 2019 and the initials CR. It was Chris's graduation ring. The one police noted was missing from his body, assumed to be taken as a trophy by the transient killer. My heart stopped. My ears started ringing. I stared at that ring, my brain frantically trying to make sense of why Sam would have it. Had the police given it back to him? No, they never found it. Did he go back to the woods and find it? Impossible. My hand started to shake as I looked deeper into the box. Underneath the ring was a stack of worn, faded Polaroid photographs. I picked them up. The first one was the picture of Chris and Dave sleeping in their tent. The exact same picture Dave had found. The one the police had taken into evidence. But this couldn't be that picture. This meant there wasn't just one picture taken that night. There were multiples. I flipped to the next photo. It was a picture of me, asleep in my tent. I flipped to the next one. It was a picture of Chris, standing by the fire, taken from the dark tree line. I flipped to the last photo, and the breath completely left my lungs. It was a picture of the creepy Blair Witch campsite, with a filthy sleeping bag and the bone wind chimes. But it wasn't a picture taken when we found it. It was a picture of the campsite being built. And sitting on the sleeping bag, looking directly into the camera lens with a cold, dead smile, was Sam. me tell you something about County Dispatch. They have a spectacular talent for ruining a perfectly quiet graveyard shift. My partner, Miller, and I were parked behind an abandoned diner on Route 9, killing time and eating terribly stale gas station taquitos when the radio crackled. It was a 1010, a disturbance call. A hiker had managed to get just enough cell service to call 911, reporting a woman screaming her lungs out near the old Blackwood logging tract. Look, nobody joins the rural county sheriff's department to hike. If I wanted to do cardio in the pitch black, I'd have bought a treadmill. But a distress call is a distress call. So we threw our coffees out the window, flipped on the light bar, and hauled out toward the tree line. The paved roads end about 4 miles before the logging tract. From there, it's nothing but a deeply rutted dirt path that swallowed our cruiser's tires whole. We had to park at the barricade, grab our heavy mag lights, and hoof it to the rest of the way in. The woods out here aren't like the state parks. There are no cute little wooden signs or paved trails. It's dense, overgrown, and ancient timber. The trees are so thick they choke out the moonlight completely. As soon as we stepped in past the tree line, the temperature dropped a good 10 degrees, and the air started to smell heavily of wet pine and damp earth. "You think it's teenagers?" Miller asked, slapping a mosquito off his neck. He was a 20-year veteran of the force, a guy who usually didn't rattle easily, but his voice sounded a little thin tonight. "Probably," I said, trying to sound confident. "Kids get drunk, wander off the path, and panic when they hear a coyote. We'll find them shivering by a dead campfire, write them a citation, and be back in the car by 3. But the deeper we walked, the more I stopped believing my own lie. The woods were dead silent. I don't mean quiet, I mean absolutely dead. No crickets, no wind rustling the leaves, no nocturnal animals scurrying in the brush, just the heavy, rhythmic crunch of our heavy-duty boots on the dirt. We found the source of the call about 2 miles in. Our flashlight beam swept across a small clearing, catching the reflective orange fabric of a pop-up tent. "Sheriff's Department," Miller yelled, his hands instinctively dropping to rest on the butt of his service weapon. "Anyone out here?" No answer. We approached slowly, our beams crisscrossing the site. My stomach did a slow, heavy roll. The tent hadn't just collapsed, it had been slashed open. Massive, rugged cuts ripped through the nylon. Sleeping bags were dragged out into the dirt, entirely soaked in dark, heavy blood. Real blood, not the fake stuff kids use for a prank. The metallic smell of it was thick in the damp air. I stepped closer, my boots squelching in the mud. I panned my light over the remains of a campfire. Next to a half-melted cooler was a pair of broken eyeglasses and a heavy, blood-stained claw hammer. "Jesus, Davis," Miller muttered, stepping back. "This isn't a bunch of drunk kids. Call it in. We need an ambulance and a crime scene unit up here right now." I grabbed the radio from my shoulder mic and pressed the button. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. We have a 1031 at the logging camp. We need..." I stopped. The radio was dead. No static, no nothing. Just an empty, hollow click. I checked my cell phone. No signal glared back at me. We were entirely cut off. That's when we heard it. "Help, please." The voice came from the dense brush to our left, about 50 yards out in the absolute darkness. It was a woman's voice, weak and ragged, like she had been screaming until her vocal cords gave out. Miller and I locked eyes. Training kicked in. We drew our weapons, holding our flashlights steady under the barrels, and started moving shoulder to shoulder toward the tree line. "County Sheriff," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're here to help. Keep talking so we can find you." We pushed through the thick wall of brush, our flashlights cutting frantic swaths through the endless trunks of pine trees. "Help, please." It sounded closer this time, just beyond a small ridge. But as I listened, a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. The cadence of the voice was exactly the same as the first time we heard it. The exact same pitch, the exact same ragged pause between the words. We crested the ridge, shining our light down into a shallow, rocky ravine. There was no woman. My flashlight beam hit a thick oak tree, illuminating a cheap, black Bluetooth speaker duct taped to the bark. A little blue light blinked on its side. It was playing a looped audio recording. "Davis," Miller whispered, his voice cracking. "It's a trap." Before either of us could turn around, the unmistakable metallic click of a hunting rifle safety being switched off echoed from the absolute darkness directly behind us. "Drop the flashlights," a man's voice rasped from the shadows, calm and completely devoid of emotion, "or you both die in this ravine." I didn't think. I just reacted. I threw myself to the side, blindly firing 2 rounds into the brush where the voice had come from, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding me. A deafening roar followed as the hunting rifle discharged, the bullet ripping through the air so close to my ear I felt the heat of it. I hit the dirt hard, scrambling behind a rotting log. "Miller!" I screamed, my ears ringing violently. "Miller, sound off!" There was no answer. The woods had gone dead silent again. The Bluetooth speaker had been hit by a stray bullet and sparked out. I lay there in the pitch black, my heart hammering against my ribs, gripping my service weapon with sweaty palms. I strained my eyes against the dark, listening for the crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig, anything. Minutes bled into an eternity. Eventually, my eyes adjusted just enough to make out the pale gray light over the ravine. I slowly raised my head over the log. Miller was gone. His flashlight lay in the dirt, the beam casting a long, useless shadow against the trees. Next to it was his service weapon, a thick, fresh drag mark cut through the mud, leading straight into the deepest part of the timber. I didn't try to play the hero. I ran. I ran all the way back to the cruiser, drove like a madman until my radio caught a signal, and called in every unit in the state. They searched those woods for 3 weeks. They brought in dogs, helicopters, and the FBI. They found the couple who owned the tent, buried in a shallow grave a mile away. But they never found the man with the hunting rifle, and they never found Miller. Just his badge, nailed to that same oak tree where the speaker had been.